legal description than people who live in town. But basically, this is the addition within the township, within the range, and then these are the lots within the section. And every time something changes on any of the lots, and it tells you what changed and where to go find the deed or the mortgage information or the easement. So it's really easy to just sort of look back, and you can find all the time something happened to the property. Everyone who owned the land. If the land was subdivided, which, I mean, if you're in a newer development, it was somebody's farm once, right? Any mortgages, sheriff's sales, oil and gas leases, your register of deeds usually has all kinds of wonderful maps that they can help find out is when your house was built, because they do not care. They're interested in the land. They're not worried about what house is on there. Sometimes if someone has old tax records, you can figure out when that house was built because the tax goes up, right? So you can usually find some sort of major change that way. But there's a lot of information you can gather there. And the biggest thing is you're going to collect all the names of the people who owned your house, because we're going to use those to check and cross-check with a lot of different resources, because again, this is how we know for sure we're talking about the correct house when we're looking at other things. Does anyone have an abstract? Is anyone lucky enough to still have an abstract? Oh, cherish your abstract. Cherish your abstract. Yay, you've got your abstract. Okay, so when we bought our house in Emporia, the abstract has everything you'll get at the Register of Deeds up until the point that the most recent date. But it also, the only other thing it can have are anytime there was some sort of legal event involving your property. And in my case, it involved, actually my house in Emporia, about every 10 years, the people there got divorced. So I'm feeling really good that we got out of there with 12 years and we're still good. But it also has things like lawsuits connected to your house. So this happens to be in the abstract we inherited when we bought our house in Emporia. And it is Marty and Lorna Anderson, who are my true crime people in Kansas. Does anyone know who Marty and Lorna Anderson are? Oh, it just clicked for you. You want to tell us?
I think she was involved with a murder for hire.
Yes.
And she was the pastor's secretary.
Yes. Good job. Good job. Yeah. So
interesting.
Yeah. Yes. There's actually a made-for-TV movie made about it that starred Kathy Bates. It was called Murder Ordained. And it was a major news story because the minister of the Missouri Synod Lutheran Church, Reverend Tom Bird, was having an affair with Lorna Anderson, who was his secretary. They were both married to other people, both had children with other people, and their respective spouses both ended up rather dead. And they both went to prison. And in fact, they're both actually out now of prison. Gossip. He is now a marriage counselor in Iowa. True story. Can't make that up. But anyway, the Andersons owned our house. And we're like, yes, do we get a plaque? You know, what do we do? But they owned it about 2 or 3 years before he was murdered. He was actually murdered on 177. She pulled over claiming that she was sick and got out of the van, and a robber popped up out of the hills and on 177 and shot him in front of their children. And that was the murder for hire that she was convicted of. But when we looked through the paperwork, so our house was something they owned as a rental, and they had 2 outstanding mortgages on this property. And the renters who had skipped out owed them $2,000, which was quite a lot of money back in 1981 in Emporia. And I think $2,000 is a lot of money now, but I work for a nonprofit. So it kind of adds this whole layer of stress, right, to what was going on in their lives as part of that story. Now, as I said, if you don't have an abstract, you can find all of this information at the Register of Deeds, because now they just do title insurance. They don't do abstracts anymore. You can have one made. It's very expensive. Figure $4 a page to get them, right? And if you have a property that's changed hands or had something happen every few years over, say, 150 years, it adds up really, really fast to get that abstract. So, but you can find pretty much everything at the Register of Deeds, except for things like this, which you have to dig a little bit more for in the newspapers and your district courts if you know that you're looking for them. So let's start with this question. How did the first owner get his or her land in Kansas? And you notice there's an asterisk there because I think we have to acknowledge that when Kansas opened up for white expansion, white settlement from the east, people here. It wasn't just a big vacancy sign, right? There were all kinds of people who lived all across Kansas. They lived here and they hunted here and they had families here and they worshiped here. So there was all kinds of people who were here. So I do have some resources on the handout that can quickly help you identify who had a settlement here as far as the indigenous populations over time. You can literally put in your zip code or your address and it will just kick up a list of different tribes to research, which is really helpful. You won't necessarily ever know names, but I think if you're telling the story of your property, that's a really important part of the story of your property, to acknowledge that they were part of that land too. So this question really refers to then, which is, who did the US government officially say was the first person? The hard thing is sometimes you go to the Register of Deeds office and what they're actually recording, depending on when your courthouse got up and running, was the first sale. But someone had to own it to sell it. So who had that first? Well, one of the few really great things that came out of the pandemic was that this information, which I used to tell you to go to the Family Search website, and you'd have to go, there's 72 volumes for Kansas, okay, for those original land grants. And you would have to flip around through 72 volumes till you found the right section and township and range. And then you could figure out who owned your land. Well, during the pandemic, they made it searchable. The government land office put all this up, and now you can click on your township and it'll list every single land grant connected to your township. And now these are the geographic townships, not the political townships that are named. But so this is a township in your township range. And so you a lot of information about everyone who was there. You can sort them by date, you can sort them by name. It's really pretty cool. And they have scans of the original land grant warrant deeds. So, and you'll find it's really interesting. You'll see all kinds of things. You'll see like this is the earliest one I could find in what's now kind of like the Sibley Township, back to 1861. And this was someone who, because of an act of Congress from 1847, it was someone who, because they enlisted for military service, was entitled to receive land, and then they in turn signed it over to someone else. They took their grant and gave it to someone else. So you will find these available. You can download them right off the website for your property. The thing to remember is if you have a house, like a smaller property, those land grants were for big properties, often big, like quarter sections or more. So you may find that you're going to have, when you might zoom in all the way to your house and you'll realize it's actually part of a much bigger grant. Okay. So we've got names, lots of names, right? And we've got a lot of other bits of information about mortgages, and we've got the original person who got that original deed. Let's talk about maps. And this is where I am going to geek out a lot, because I can look at maps having nothing to look for. Like, I just love them. They tell us so many things. So that's why I use the biggest font I could fit. So remember these guys. When Kansas was open for settlement, after the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854, John Calhoun was the official surveyor who was assigned to start the process of surveying Kansas. And it took a long time. They started at the edge of civilization, right? Missouri. And they worked their way west. And so they worked their way west. So they started 1855, and it took them, I think the ones I saw from like Colby and Goodland were looking at the 1870s when they finished. It takes a long time to walk all of Kansas up and down and sideways. So this happens to be the earliest one, connected actually to the grant that I just showed you, that land grant deed. This is the earliest one that's available for this part. And I was really excited when I saw this because I'm really fascinated by early Kansas history. And I've heard mention of Lake Sibley. I'm like, where the heck is that? Ta-da! Right there. It was still a lake. And so the kinds of things that you see on this, let's see if I can zoom in a little bit. Okay. So some of the things you see, they mark out obviously all of the sections. And by the way, there are journals at the State Historical Society where they tell you what material they use to mark at every single corner, whether they used a rock, a stick, or whatever thing that is probably no longer there. They tell you what they use. But you have the sections, and particularly out in the eastern side, they kind of get tired in western Kansas, I notice, and they just put in the lines a lot of times. But you'll see things like the trails. So here is the trail to Fort Kearney. Yep, that's up there. You've got the river. You've got the tree lines along the river. You've got the lake. I have seen, when they're really bored, when they draw in clump of trees, bluff, abandoned Indian village, things like that.
It's too bad it doesn't show where Fort Sibley was at.
Yeah, I know. What years was the fort active?
Well, that they had sent 200 soldiers out from 200 soldiers?
Mm-hmm.
And they built the fort, which it sounds like it's somewhere almost in line with out there by Barbara Shun out there in that area.
Okay.
And they even say where Ezra Atkins is buried, that he was buried within the shadow of the fort. And it was built on a perpendicular slope, so the one side they didn't even put a corrugated walls up, so it only had 3 walls.
Sort of had a natural barrier.
Which doesn't make sense in that area. It's like, okay, where's something that high? So with the different floodings going on and stuff.
Yeah.
And
they
didn't stay there.
Was it 1861 when this map was finished?
I can't remember, but the thing was that they didn't man the fort. And so it sounds like the settlers took the lumber from the fort, but it still was when Ezra was there, because like I said, they said he was buried within the shadow of the fort.
Why waste good materials? Yeah. Why waste stones that have already been cut and go cut your own when there's a perfectly good pile of stones nobody's using? Yeah, for sure. So they're
in section 21.
21.
And
is it on
Atkins is buried the next row west.
So here's 21 right there, I think. Yeah, that's 21. So he's where?
He'd be just to your left.
So he's like right
there, or possibly
right in this area.
Yeah.
Oh, that's so cool. Thank you for sharing that. I'm fascinated by that. Okay, so this is what you can find, though. You can find these apps. You can download them from the GLO website. They're totally free. So you can go play with those, and they're really interesting. So, but that gets us thinking about trails, doesn't it? Because there are roads all over the place. And we talk a lot about, in Kansas, we talk a lot about Santa Fe Trail. We talk about the Oregon Trail. We talk about the Chisholm Trail. We talk about the Smoky Hill or Smoky Valley Trail, Smoky Hill Trail. It's got a lot of names depending on which route you're on. The BOD Trail. I mean, it's got a lot of names depending on where you're at. But there are also the trails that just connect people to water or each other, or the trail between my house and my brother's house. I mean, in my own yard, I joke that we've got a path in the summer that you can see. It kind of undulates from house to house through the grass in the front yards. And I call it the Postal Carrier's Trail, because the postal carrier always takes the exact same route, and the grass is just this much shorter than it is in the rest of the yard, because he's got a path, right? So these are all roads, and some of these roads are under roads today, or under railroads, or you can sometimes see the ruts. And that's one of my passions, is I will pull over for any sign that says trail ruts. That way, I will pull over and look. But they're also sometimes under your house or through your dining room. They're just not in use anymore, but they're still part of the story of your space. So this is a Mitchell sectional map of Kansas. It's from 1859. I love these old maps because the trails are so prominent, because they didn't have railroads yet. So the trails are still really important to getting around. So here we are, and you are on this map, sort of. Okay, so where are we? We are kind of like this, right? It's sort of kind of midway between these two counties. And they've drawn in, you can see they've surveyed the sections. And you can see these, there's the rivers, and you can see a lot of trails. And look at all the trails they connect to. So why does it not have a name yet in 1859?
Well, actually, part of the thing was we were part of Washington County there for a little bit.
Uh-huh.
So,
But the county wasn't an official county till 1860. So there's no county name yet. And then it looks like it changed names a few times very rapidly. There was possibly a Sherman attached to it, possibly a Shirley attached to it.
Shirley
Yeah.
and fight over it because of changing the name because they thought we were named after a prostitute. So.
That is a great story.
It was either the governor of Boston, but he was, I don't know if that doesn't make sense either because he favored the British.
Just last week, I had somebody in Clyde wanting to know about Shirley Township. And her last name was Shirley. And she was from Ogden.
Okay.
This lady was from Leavenworth.
Yeah. Well, anyway, I told him that story that you told. And I said, I shouldn't have said that.
So, but it's actually, there's the controversy is actually documented in the Cutler's History of Kansas, published by audience. Come on in and ask about Shirley. They'd love to tell you the story if you didn't catch it live here. But you can see though that they have surveyed it. You can see that they've documented these trails. And just to think a little bit more about trails. So this is my historical society. We have 36,000 photos of Franklin County. And this is one of them. This is one of my favorites. This is the construction of the Main Street Bridge. It's the dedication, July 2nd, 1926. It's a cool picture, but it's not what the picture that's being, the focus of the picture that I find really interesting. What I'm finding really interesting is what's happening in this red circle. So, all right. So we've got a couple of cars there zipping across the Meridicine River. Why is that? Well, Ottawa is at the center of the county, and basically roughly through the center, going from west to east, you've got the Meridicine River. And Ottawa is where it is because that's where you could ford the river. So if you look at the trails are like an hourglass. They're all over the county, and then they sort of do this, and then they spread back out. And the actual crossing was Hickory Street, but the bridge was built at Main Street, which is where the main road was. In fact, the first bridge was actually owners, and they charged a toll. And we have these pictures that just tickle me that show an empty bridge up here and everybody using the ford because they weren't paying a stinking toll unless there was a flood. So it's kind of funny. And then the bridge became city property soon thereafter. They didn't make their fortune that they were expecting to make. But it gets us thinking about the fact that the roads are not always where they are now. You could up until 1959 in low water. And in 1959, they started the flood control project through Ottawa, and they dug the river base down 50 feet, widened it 100 feet, and then built the levees up. And we've still tested that a few times in the last few years. Because Ottawa floods enthusiastically and often. Let's talk about plat books, and we have some examples here, and I have some ideas that I can share with you afterwards about how you can make them last longer. So we'll talk about that too. Plat books are wonderful, especially if you're researching rural property or property that used to be rural, right? So the cool thing is a lot of these are now, in fact, all three of those you can also access for free online through the State Historical Society website, kansasmemory.org. You can access even more through Historic MapWorks. You can look at those for free, but you can't print those out from the state. You can download the pages if you want to download the pages. And you've also got them here, which they're really nice to look at in person too, because particularly up through about the 1920s, they're art. I mean, they're just beautiful pieces of art as well as very informative. So let's look at what you can see here. So this is, again, we're looking at basically Sibley Township. Here's Concordia. Here's a lake, which now, of course, if you look at the satellite images, you can see just the shadow of it just a hint. But let's zoom in a little bit and see what we can see. So, and you'll be able to look at this up close in person too if you haven't. We've got the railroads. Here's the city of Concordia. Here's the lake. You can see all these wonderful little old channel, new channel. This tells us a lot about how the river is still kind of it's an alive river. It's shifting with different floods. All these little boxes, these little black squares, those are all houses. So if you've got farmland and you're going, I know that there was a house here, but it's long gone, it's been torn down. This can help you kind of figure out where it was. It mentions where the schools were. So there's a little schoolhouse. There's a cemetery right there. I've seen windmills. I've seen racetracks. Down by Fredonia, it says mound. So, anything interesting could pop up there. And particularly when you're looking at them over the years, you can also see how things change. From a genealogy research perspective, a lot of times you figure out families this way. Why did those two people meet and marry? Their farms were next to each other. They grew up next door. They went to the same school. So there's a lot to be learned. And they usually have the rivers. They have the roads. They'll add in, sometimes they'll have the postal routes too, which is also helpful when you're researching, because sometimes, again, those addresses used to just be, rural postal route 4 or whatever the case might have been. But sometimes you'll be able to actually see those drawn in, and you can at least, if you know what you're looking for, if you know it's on rural route 4, you can at least follow it around and try to find the right property if you're not sure, if you're looking at the right space. And the names of everybody who owns those big plots of land are there. So there's a lot of information available through these. Okay. Who's looked at a Sanborn fire insurance map? Yay. Okay. These are my favorite rabbit hole. And the really wonderful thing is that all of the ones from the 1920s backwards, really, sometimes 19s for sure, are available online for you to look at. So the Sanborn fire insurance maps are really different from other maps because they were designed for fire departments and insurance companies to assess risk. Where's the water? What are the buildings built? How many buildings are there? What are they used for? So they drew in chicken coops, the sheds, the carriage houses, and they indicated how many windows, how many floors. Is it made of brick? Is it made of wood? Is it made of iron sheeting? What is it made of? What's in it? Is it a tailor shop? Is it a foundry? All of that information is on these maps, and they are really, really accurate. Yeah, there are a couple of little examples here too.
They even say if they have a night watchman.
Yeah.
What type of lamps they use, because those are the
They do
elements.
heat sources a lot of times. Yeah. And where the wells are, and later where the hydrants are. And they're really, really amazing. And they update them with some regularity. So these started kind of in the mid to late 1880s, and they kept them going through about the 1920s. And then in the 1920s, they started, and they did this for towns all over the United States. That's what's so amazing. And they would then sell just updates, the little paste-ins that you glued in on top of your newest map, which sounds like a really, really tedious thing for someone to have to do, but that's what they did. These were really expensive. Most towns could only afford to buy 1, maybe 2 copies. So the insurance companies and the fire department pooled their resources to buy them. Because think about it, they're making a custom map for every city that's only going to be used by a handful of people. But they've been scanned. The KU has lots of them available online. The Library of Congress has lots of them available online. And 3 of your towns are really well documented. So that's really amazing. So let's zoom in and see what we see here. All right. So let's start. Well, let me back up. We'll say Broadway Street still exists, right? We know that. 6th Street, 5th Street. So we're actually really close to where we are right now. Okay, we'll kind of zoom in a little bit here. Everything yellow, those are wood frame, wood construction, okay? Brick is red. This is going to be stone or concrete, that blue color. If you see gray, it's usually iron cladding, real common in the Victorian era for buildings to have ironclad fronts. You can see the lot numbers going across. You can see things like the names of things like Concordia Hotel, a livery feed. DWG is dwelling, so those are the houses. You can see all the little sheds and things behind. And then you see some blue dots. What are the blue dots? What would be a, huh? Nope.
Water hydrant.
Just well. A blue dot is just a well. A hydrant will usually have a little H. And then you'll see these little dashed lines that show you where the water lines go. When I looked at Ottawa in about this same time period, there was a well behind every house. Every house. And as someone who grew up my formative years, including little baby Jessica McClure falling down the well, I find this terrifying because who filled those in? And did they do a good job? Because people do find them. And I'll tell you, when I was in Allen County in Iola doing this program, I had 3 people tell me I fell down a well I didn't know was their story. So be really careful in Allen County because something went wrong there when they filled in their wells. So, but there were wells all over the place. And then as you get into more recent versions, you're going to start seeing the water lines, right? So they documented, though, you can see this is the porch. You can see that, it's got what kind of roof. You can see how many rooms, how many floors, how many windows. All of that's available. As the town got bigger with each successive map, they had more pages usually to the map. The map got bigger too. So particularly if you have an older house in the older part of town, you're more likely to be represented. My house, I can almost stand in the map and see it just past the edge of the map in 1912. It doesn't show up till the 1924 map.
Some of the streets will also include the scales that businesses use.
Yes, that is absolutely right. You'll see the scales. Like there's actually one right here. There's one right there. But these are delightful. You can look at even if your house isn't going to show up in one of these, take a look at these maps. They're online and they're really wonderful to look at because they're so informative and they're very accurate. So those are the Sanborn maps. And as I said, the KU Research Library, Spencer Research Library, they've got over 5,300 pages of them available for you to look at. They're wonderful. Okay. So we've got a lot more now going on in terms of our understanding of our space. Let's take a look at the people who are connected. You've already made that huge list, right, of everyone who's owned your land. But the people who own the land and the people who live in the property aren't always exactly the same. So we're going to start by just starting to take a look at the records from the census. This is a little bit trickier if you're doing rural property before there were addresses. But you've got names to look for, so you can start with that to get a sense of who all might be connected to it. And these records are wonderful because you can learn not just about the owner, but any other family, any people who were boarding with them, what they did, where they were from. Sometimes it helps you make sense of your house. You might discover that your house is a brick fortress because the person who built it ran the brick factory. And sometimes you'll find there's someone I know who they were puzzled as to why the house was built with rooms that did not have access from the inside. Well, it was a doctor's house, and those were his business rooms, which were separate from the house. He went outside and treated it like an office. It was just attached to the house. The trick about the census is they're only every 10 years, and 1890, which is a really pivotal year for Kansas in terms of growth and change, burned up in a fire in 1921. Those records are gone. Back up your records. So, but there are some Kansas records that were on the 5s that help fill in some of that information. So you can get a lot of information there. We'll also look at city directories. I've got some examples here. City directories are like phone books, but much more in depth. City directories existed before there were phones. They have information in lots. One is by name. One is a reverse address look, and then later a reverse phone look. And then there's also a business section. And they can be very helpful, particularly if you have renters You can figure out who's renting. They updated these every year. And also, if you're researching one of those downtown businesses that has lots of levels, like a first floor for a store and then maybe apartments upstairs, that's a great way to find it, because a lot of those business buildings, just like today, were real estate investments, and they rented out all that property, and who was in there changed out every year. Now, here's the thing about city directories. Their commitment to accuracy was not always as strong as it could be. People get resurrected from the dead several years later. They put in people who never lived there. Sometimes they spell names wrong, but they're still a really great resource as a match up to see if those landowners are the same as your actual residents or actual owners of the businesses. And that will help you when you start doing newspaper searches, because then you know you're looking for the same people. All right, other things to look for. Probates and wills are public records in Kansas. Vital trading, because in Kansas, they became state records in 1911. And at that point, they did not become public records anymore. Anything that exists before 1911 that was recorded by the county is a public record. A lot of counties, though, said, oh, we don't need to keep these anymore, and shucked them. Johnson County threw away all of their records long time ago. So they don't have them. A lot of times they end up in historical societies or libraries or genealogy collections. So if you can find them, they can be helpful from before 1911. We actually have a book called The Death Index, which is fascinating because it lists every single, it's just a record that has every single person who died, who the next of kin was that claimed them, and what got them. And a lot of people got hit by lightning in Franklin County, it turns out. It's kind of amazing. So those are other resources, but if you can find them, that can also help you understand who lived in your house. Cemetery records, biographical files, if someone's maintaining those, yearbooks, annuals. If community museums and libraries, spaces like this are really, really helpful. University and college collections are digitizing more and more of what they have, and you can look at what they have online. And I listed a few of those resources for you. And the State Historical Society has digitized a lot of information too. Now, today, we've also got social media groups. I think every town has a Facebook group that says, I remember insert town name when, and there's pictures that people share. And sometimes it's a picture of something, but they don't realize it's also a picture of your house behind it. And then now you've got access to a picture of your house from 50 years ago. So there's a lot of places to find information. So speaking of Facebook and photos, I want to talk about the challenges of looking at photos. Again, we have 36,000 photos in our collection, but think about how historical societies get photos. You live in California. Your grandma died. You have 1 week to clean her house out. You're going through the attic. There is a box of photos. You're like, I don't know who any of these people are. And you sheepishly go to the historical society, place it on the table in front of them and say, do you want these? And the historical society says, yes. But part of you also goes, oh, who are these people? So you only have the information you have, right? If it says Nana and Joe on the back, that's all you know about that photo. But sometimes it has names. Sometimes it's a picture and it says, Bob and Margaret Smith in front of their first home. We don't know where the house is, but think about all that research you've just done on your land, right? You've got names. If you know that Bob and Margaret Smith owned your property, that could be your house. So you can build more information. And sometimes you have to get really creative. So these are local pictures.
And I wouldn't get rid of pictures because they're developing, or somebody on Ancestry or something like that has said, oh, this is a picture of my certain relative. That eventually they'll say with facial recognition that they'll be able to identify those pictures of people we don't know yet. So don't throw family photos.
They end up on a Cracker Barrel wall.
Yeah.
I mean, they do. I think about, I feel very sad going into Cracker Barrel sometimes. I'm like, these are somebody's ancestors.
Not in the trash.
That is true.
Everybody's enjoying the clothing they're wearing.
That is true. That is true.
So I've been on Find a Grave and I found my grandfather's picture on somebody else's.
Oh, they just,
Yeah, it's his wedding picture.
Oh, wow. That's awkward.
You do.
Now, I do know someone in Ottawa whose great great grandfather had two families in two towns. So I'm just saying. In fact, it was our former county coroner. So you just never know. But yeah, and you know, the family trees, just because someone makes a family tree doesn't mean it's an accurate family tree. Not everyone's lucky enough to have a wild and wacky last name like mine that is pretty easy to distinguish. So I pulled several pictures. Most of these came off of the State Historical Society website, and most of these are local. Has anyone seen this photo before? You've seen it? Okay, this is a local picture. So this is a 4th of July parade in 1910 here in Concordia, and it's actually focused on the Knights of Pythias, and it's a parade photo. That's how it's identified, right? But we're in Concordia. These are buildings in Concordia in the background, and as long as you can figure out the intersection, you can figure out what you're looking at. This could be helpful if that's your building, right? You've got information now of what that building looked like in 1910. Ottawa floods enthusiastically and often. It looks like parts of this area have too in the past. This happens to be a flood west of Elm Creek Bridge in Clyde in 1950. And they're documenting the flood. And honestly, we all do this too. So Ottawa, we've got the flood control, and they have gates on the Main Street Bridge, but the Prairie Spirit Trail is taller than the Main Street Bridge. So when they go get ready to close the gates, we all rush out onto the Prairie Spirit Trail Bridge to watch them close the gates, and we all take pictures. So this is very documented every time the water gets high enough, gets over 33 feet. So, but they're taking the picture because of the flood, but there are two houses here that are part of the story. They don't tell us the address. They don't tell us who lives in them. But if we know where Elm Creek is, we know where the bridge is. Then if these houses are still standing, or if they're not, that's also part of the story. We've got information there about these spaces. Okay, this is a tongue twister. It's Margretha Hodgson and Grandma Margetha Hanson Beck. 1918-ish. And this is in Glasgow. Please correct me if I say names wrong. Kansas names can be tricky sometimes. But we don't know the address, but we know it's Grandma's house. If we run into Grandma's name when we're doing our research, this might be the house. And the house might still be there. The porch may have lost its gingerbread, but now you know what it looks like. Okay, I love this photo so much that even though it's not local, I always use it because it's hilarious. Brother Walter and myself at his spring near his house near Blaine, Kansas, so Pottawatomie County, 1907 in a brewery and bootlegging album. Next picture says that's Schlitz, that they're tucking away there during a time period that they're not supposed to have alcohol. But that's somebody's property. So if you run into Walter near Blaine, this could be your land that they're, quietly keeping their liquor cold, and maybe your spring is even still there. Coming back here, I believe is it Sorgatz? The Sorgatz drugstore here in Concordia. 1892 to 1920 is when they date this photo, and I believe the great thing about this photo, there aren't a lot of interiors before about 1915. There just aren't, because they're dark. They're hard to photograph, but this is a really great one. If this building is still standing and you have this downtown building, this is going to tell you what it looked like and how it was used. And it's going to tell you why you have weird holes in the floor where you do. And it's going to tell you why you've got a hole in the side where the potbelly stove used to be. So there's a lot of information in this particular picture. It's so detailed. You can see all this detail just in that fan. It's wonderful. All right. And I love this one so much. So this is, I'm going to go with Neitzel's. Neitzel's? Neitzel's? German names are tricky after World War II because weird things happened to them. So drugstore here in Concordia, about the same time period, 1917-ish to 1919-ish. So this picture is great for two reasons. The first is it's a great storefront picture, right? We can see exactly what that window looked like. You've got the detail. This is almost certainly cast iron. And in fact, we had a foundry in Ottawa that made these, and they show up all over the state. So I'm always on the lookout for Ottawa Foundry on these buildings. But what else is in this picture? Person. What else? What's in the window? Look at the window. What is going on in the actual glass
A reflection.
of the building across the street?
Oh, okay. Well, I'm getting a reflection of.
You're getting a reflection of the light here.
Of those things.
Yeah, so you can see the building and some of the architectural features of the building across the street, which can be useful in two ways. One, it can help you figure out where this picture was taken if you didn't know, because if you know the building across the street, you can line it up. Or it can, if that building across the street is gone, it can help you date when this is 1917 to 1919 and that building is there. The building that is currently there is not the same. Then it helps you build a bit of a timeline about when something changed. So always look in the glass. And this is especially useful in Ottawa. They always took the parade pictures from the west side. So if you ask us for an east side picture, we're golden. If you ask for a west side picture, I'm like, I'll see what I can do. I don't know, because the street when they took pictures of parades. So
Another way to date too is if it's when automobiles around and you look
Yeah.
down the license tags.
yes, and if they have a license tag, because there was a period of time when there wasn't a required tag or wasn't a tag requirement. And then enough people got run over and they're like, we really need to know which black car hit somebody. So there are a lot of creative ways to use photos that aren't necessarily, here is a picture of 832 South Cedar, that can help you fill out the story of your house. And sometimes we're not even looking at pictures. So this is a drawing it is Caldwell down in Sumner County along the Chisholm Trail. It was drawn by Ado Hunius. He was a cartographer who was hired to follow the military around, and he journaled. His journals are available online, and they're actually all transcribed if you don't want to hassle with the cursive. But he drew pictures as well as maps. And is this a great picture of Caldwell? Not really, but it tells us something about what was prominent in town, but also how new it was, because what's behind it? That's a log cabin and a well behind the big fancy hotel front. So it tells us a lot about the town in transition during this time. And I believe this was about 1876, I think. Yeah, 76, when that was drawn. So there are a lot of other ways to find illustrations. A lot of the plat books used to have pictures of the grand houses in the back or the important farms. And then be on the lookout for real photo postcards. Once the post office started letting you print your own postcards, everybody got a postcard camera. And some of these were one-offs. You just printed one to send to your mom. Look at my house. You didn't print 40 of them or 100 of them. I happened to find this one in an antique store. 99 cents plus tax. I actually bought it for the snarky, passive-aggressive language on the card because I found it really funny. Dear Kennedy, what is the matter with you? I have written you twice and Johnson once, and I never hear from you. And I just thought that was hilarious. But then, this is my store, my building. Do you like it? Ask Mr. K what he thinks of concrete for a building. Solid concrete, except for the ceiling and the roof. And it was signed Bella A. And that was enough information for me to find that Bella Alex built this building in Ottawa in about 1910. It became Pettit's Tin Shop. He did all the tin ceilings and then later did ductwork. And then this building was sold to a creamery. And Ottawa floods enthusiastically and often. And by the 1930s, this building was no longer there. But I found all of this. This is the origin story. And this might be the only postcard of its kind. And I found it for 99 cents plus tax in an antique store. So flip through all the postcards at the antique store because you never know what you'll find.
And stereoscope.
And yes. Well, for us in Ottawa, so Underwood & Underwood was the biggest stereoscope maker. And he was there in Ottawa. So we had thousands. But not all of them, but he did them for all over, not just Franklin County. Okay. newspapers, and I picked this one because this ad actually tickles me. 17,562 dozen buttons for sale during Button Week. And I find that an oddly specific number. But anyway, newspapers, every town strived to have a newspaper. Didn't matter how big or small we were. Every town wanted a newspaper. It was proof that you were a real town. La Loupe in Franklin County had a newspaper for 3 months before it folded. But it's 3 months of documented time in La Loupe. So Lyon County, they had 44 newspapers in their history. That's real common for a county. Every town wanted one. Lots of towns had competing papers. There was the Democrat paper. There was the Republican paper. There was the Free Spirit paper. You know, every town had many papers. So, and the great thing for us today is the state library has scanned all of the papers they have in their collection. And by the way, Kansas Historical Society has one of the largest newspaper collections in the world. Because when they got started, they contacted every existing paper and said, send us a copy of your paper. And they collected them all. So they have one of the largest in the world, and they've put them up on newspapers.com to make them accessible through 1924 at that time, because that was the copyright cutoff that they could do it without having to get permission. And then there are more out on microfilm at the libraries and at the State Historical Society and possibly at your local library. And you may have paper copies as well. You might have bound copies here. I'm really terrified about the demise of the newspaper, because I can tell you that the man who built my house had a oath on his neck because it was in the paper. I can tell you all kinds of things about what happened at my house, but that information is not going to exist in 20 years for what I'm doing right now. It's all going on Facebook. Is Facebook going to exist in 20 years? Even digital-only newspapers only exist as long as someone is paying for the server space. Is someone printing those out? And those out. There's a snapshot you get from a newspaper with all of these things that happen at the same time that you don't get from a digital news story. So I have real concerns about what footprint, with all the information we have right now, what footprint we're going to leave for people to make sense of us in 20 years, 50 years, 100 years. So that's my pitch for supporting your local newspaper, because you need your local newspaper. So lots of stuff in newspapers. You've got all those names that you've collected from the city directory, from the Register of Deeds, from maybe people identified in photos. You've got people who we found in the census records. So you've got all kinds of people to look up in the newspaper, because the nice thing is these are all searchable. Sometimes they flub, and sometimes I actually have a collection called Ways My Name Has Been Spelled Wrong. So my last name is rather treacherous to look up, because people do terrible things to my last name in print. But you can still do pretty well looking for names and addresses, which you can also start to collect, and you'll be able to put together a lot more information. And I have this up here. This picture does not go with these stories, but it's just a reminder that buildings move. Why waste perfectly good materials? And really, a frame house is not hard to move, especially before there were zoning requirements of any sort. So you could pick it up and put it wherever you wanted to. And I'm stunned at how far some of those buildings could move at a time when there were no real roads. We had a town called Ohio City. It was the county seat before Ottawa became the county seat. And when Ohio City lost the county seat, people picked up their houses and moved them up a wagon trail into Ottawa. We have a great story about Judge Daniel Valentine. His family lived in their house while it was trekking its way up. And they got stuck in a creek for 3 days, and they made it. So there are actually four houses in Ottawa that are older than Ottawa, because they were from the 1850s, and Ottawa was established in 1864. So houses move. And if you find your house moved, and these are from my house, it moved, then you've got a whole other property to go research, don't you? Because you've got a new story that you have to go chase down. And then look for anything that happened in your neighborhood. You live near train tracks, you probably show up in there once in a while. People get hit by trains. Fires happen in your neighborhood. Maybe your neighbor's house caught fire. Maybe the picture of your neighbor's house on fire has part of your house in the side of the picture just by accident. Maybe there was a car wreck in front of your house. Maybe there was a festival in front of your house. Maybe the parade route went in front of your house. There are a lot of ways to look for news stories that aren't necessarily attached to your address that might be a connection to make sense of your property. Okay, we have a big toolbox. You guys have just learned a whole bunch of stuff that you can do to collect information. So let's think about this, how to put this together. And I'm going to tell you the story of my house. I feel like I'm standing right under a heat vent somewhere here because the air is hot and dry. So we have since rebuilt the porch because my husband fell through this one. I don't recommend waiting until that point to rebuild your porch, but it's a big porch. But this is the last time we had good landscaping. Like, it's just not there. So I'm still using this picture. So my house, this is the original part of the house. This moved from several blocks away to where it is now. And this is the, just so you kind of know. So here's the collection of stuff. And I'm still collecting. I've been working on this story for 10 years. And I'm still collecting. Every time I think I'm done, a new story comes up. A new resource comes up. But we're going to start here. So my house, we know from the tract book, was actually a Indian tribe. It was part of their reserves. Franklin County had almost a dozen different reservations on what is now Franklin County before they were all pushed out or lost their federal recognition in order to get allotments. Mine was for the Ottawa, and they were supposed to build a school, which they did. Ottawa University was built. So the trade was, we will give you some land for the city of Ottawa if you build us a school. They built the school, and the Ottawa were immediately kicked out of Franklin County after that. The Ottawa, if you are a member of the Ottawa tribe, you can attend Ottawa University for free now, but they lost their land. So Robert Atkinson, who conveniently enough was a trustee for Ottawa University, acquired the land. And you can see it changes hands a whole lot. And there were a lot of funny games played in some of those early city efforts to build the city. Everybody bought and sold, drove the tax prices up just for the sake of building some revenue for the town. It goes into a sheriff's sale, but Robert Atkinson ultimately ends up with it. And after he died, his probate, we find the will, he had several children and a wife. Margaret Atkinson was his wife, and Margaret Topping is the one who actually inherits land. And there was land, horses, cattle, hogs, and farming implements, because it was a bigger piece of land than it is now. Well, Margaret didn't want the land, so she sold it. And she sold it to this handsome fellow. This is a man named Grant Crane. And he bought kind of about the equivalent of what I'd say maybe a quarter of a block, a city block right now. So that many lots. And he's kind of an interesting guy. So his family's pretty early in Franklin County. They start out in Peoria. They spell their name two different ways depending on which branch of the Crane family it is, which is kind of maddening. And then they all have 9 children, and then they all name their 9 children after each other's 9 children. So untangling the genealogy is a little maddening. Fortunately, there's only one Grant, so that's handy. But he becomes a school teacher. He marries Laura Shively, and there's this lovely newspaper article about wishing them unbounded joy and prosperity. And they move around. They go to Richmond, which is about 20 minutes south of Ottawa. And he actually starts the high school. We have a picture of the high school on his last day at the high school. His wife dies when they're down there. And she's buried in Shively Cemetery, her family cemetery. And then he ends up moving he moves to Ottawa. And he goes to Gem City Business College, which sounds a little sketchy, but I've actually met other people who have ancestors who went to Gem City Business College. And he got basically a degree there. So he goes on to OU, and he teaches in the business department. He teaches typing. He teaches accounting. He teaches stenography. He teaches all the kinds of business things you need back then. He was the admissions counselor. He was a professor, and then he was the career services guy. So he's traveling all the time. One of his typists ended up being known as the fastest typist in the world, 239 words a minute on a manual typewriter. I can feel and I'm a fast typist, but not that fast. But I can feel my fingers catching in the keys just thinking about it. He actually went to the exposition in demonstrated typing. People stood around to watch him type. So he was he was pretty amazing. But he when OU built he's traveling a lot. So you'll see a lot of these, right? We've all seen these in the paper. Someone's either going or someone's coming in. File this away though, because Kansas City turns out to be more. Just keep that in mind. So OU builds their new administration building. I think this is 1901 or 1902, 1903. It burns down 2 days before school starts. And he's actually mentioned in the newspaper article about running in to grab a typewriter because they just put all of his new equipment in and it catches fire. And he's trying, but those old typewriters, those are cast iron. They're 30 pounds each. I have an Oliver number 9. I had to really muscle that thing out of the car into my house. So we know that he's living near there. And what we find out is he's living with his brother at this time across the street. So he buys an old house that was owned by R.S. Black. R.S. Black happened to be a doctor who, before the Santa Fe Hospital was built, had offices at the Santa Fe Depot, which is now the old Depot Museum, which is part of where I work, which is kind of nice in a cyclical sort of way. So he buys this bit of house, brings it to Cedar Street. And we know this is an old house because it shows up in the 1872 bird's eye view map, which Concordia has one of about this same era as well that you can access. And here it is, it was in the 1885 Sanborn map. There's one of those pesky wells. It's actually under the house that's built there now. But he bought it, moves it, and builds the addition. And my house still pretty much looks like this. So there's some surprises. One, look at the beautiful gingerbread. We wanted to put the gingerbread on, and even before the pandemic, they quoted us $15,000 because of the 50 linear feet of gingerbread. I work for a nonprofit. That's not going to happen. So, and then there's also a front door here that isn't there anymore. And then there's some stairs here. Well, we do not currently have stairs coming out of our bathroom. So, something changed there. Probably the bathroom was an old porch, would be my best guess. But otherwise, for the most part, it pretty much looks like that. And there are little stories about, notice there's no real address. It just says Crane's house, which it's okay because we know Crane owned this property. We've done that research. So we know this is the house that was being painted and papered. We know he moves in because the city directory shows that he's there. Now, I saw this article about him spending Christmas in Lawrence and Miss Ruby Macy spending Christmas in Lawrence. That's Ruby Macy. And then I found a marriage license between Grant Crane and Ruby Macy getting married in Lawrence. And I don't know, can you see the age? He's 42 and she's 18, maybe.
Yeah.
They get married and tell no one. This is his student. Okay? So he decides he's ready to run his own business college, and he's going to build his own business college. Partners with a man named Guy, G-U-Y, and they get started on building. And then she graduates from school about a year later, and they announce that they got married over the holidays, but not which holidays, just over the holidays. Everyone wishes them well. The building of his new business school gets delayed because of the Johnson-Jeffries fight. Anyone know this boxing match? So you do? Do you know it?
Yeah.
Okay. So it was Johnson was the black heavyweight champion. Jeffries was the white heavyweight champion. This fight happened in Reno, Nevada in 1910. Johnson won. White movie theater owners who showed these films refused to show the films. This caused riots and striking all over the country, including Ottawa. They went on strike at building the building because of film footage, which is so interesting. But it gets built, and the building's actually still standing. And they had these wonderful newspaper ads, and there were stories about Grant Crane standing in the window throwing candy out at people to get their attention, stories about carloads coming in on the train full of equipment being hoisted up through the windows to the second. A lot of stories about it. Everything was going swimmingly. And then this happens. Can you read does the glare let you see it? For breach of promise, suit filed for $25,000 in district court today. Miss Ethel McKee alleges large damage because Professor Crane declined to marry her. Remember all those trips to Kansas City? That was her. Also a student who thought they were engaged. And she didn't find out that he was married until everyone else found out that he was married, which, as we know, was not over the most recent holidays, but the previous holidays. And she thought they were engaged. So she sues him. And it is the most entertaining summer that ever happened in Ottawa to that point. So why does all this matter? They read all 300 of Grant Crane's letters to her on the stand. They're delightful. He's kind of a jerk. But he was documenting the entire process of the house, building it, what the rooms were for, installing the phone line, installing the gas lines. All of it was in those letters because he was sending her to buy furnishings for a house she would never, ever set foot in. But it was on the letters. Nobody else would care about this. My husband and I were so excited when we saw this story. But the letters themselves are just very scandalous. They're wonderful. And the reason why they had not yet gotten married, it was always an excuse. When she had been sick, her hair had fallen out. So he's like, don't you want to wait until your hair grows back in? Don't you want to wait until I finish building the house? Don't you want to wait until... on and on and on. And then they have a fight because she thinks he's seeing another student, a third student in Colorado. Yeah, right. So anyway, the jury said, yeah, you're going to have to pay. So they did pay. She's awarded $10,000.
That's a lot of money back then.
It is a lot of money back then. So I really hope Ethel McKee did something really good with that money. But he ends up fine. City still loves him. He's everyone's favorite social lion. His wife stays by his side. Business is doing great. This is probably why I have no barn, because he ran into it with his car. And then he passes away in the 1930s in my living room after breakfast. Ruby takes over the business college and then moves to a new location where the Chamber of Commerce building is today. And we know that she's now the manager of the business college because of the city directory. And her mother dies in the room that I use as my office upstairs. Then we know that she becomes a woman of her heart, the Register of Deeds, the genealogist of the land. And someone else takes over the business college. And the business college basically shuts down about World War II. So she's fallen on hard times. She's wanting to rent out the upstairs. This may explain why the walls are in kind of weird places, because if they tried to do stuff to make it more of an apartment. We have an address on there, yeah. And it's always been 832 South Cedar. But yeah, they finally put an address. This is the first time we saw an address. And a phone number. He had a phone very early on. Yeah. He had a phone and the reason why we had that second door to the house was that was his office for his students to go in and to visit. He had a study with a library on one side, and then he had a parlor and a study, and then a parlor and the kitchen and dining room on the other side for the family. So Ruby has some health issues. She collapses in the street, and then she sells the house. She sells the house in 1959, and she moves to Neodesha. And so in just that, there was a lot of history there in a very short period of time. And it was an amazing story. And the only thing we did to get this story is we bought the least bad house we could afford. You buy the house that you get. But there's a story of some sort attached to every single property. And maybe it's not quite as scandalous as my having one house attached to a murderer and one house attached to someone who spent way too much time with the students. But every house has got humans in it. When you have humans, they do interesting things. So that kind of shows you how you can pull all of that information together. And as you get to know your house and the people in it, you're going to go back through and re-examine sources you've looked at before, and you go, oh, this is important after all. And you'll just keep growing the story of your space. So my goal is to have this put into two different books, one for us and one in the event we ever sell this house on to that next person so that they have it. But it's just something to think about. We're all living our lives in our houses, and someday we'll be part of a story as well. And maybe like Grant Crane, I will hide the owner's keys every time I tell it for a few days, just to let them know that I'm not feeling real great about my story being told. So with that, any questions? Have I overwhelmed you? So many things. Yeah. We have copies of the plat maps up here and some city directories. And I think there's a computer that we can pull up some Sanborn maps if you want to look at those. And I can hang out here for a bit. If you are at home, I will send Vicki the handouts, and then she can distribute them to whoever might be asking for them. So just contact the Cloud County Historical Society. So I don't know if there's any questions at home. Nope, it looks like you're going through YouTube. Okay.
And these also come in handy.
Oh, very good. The enumeration records. Yes. Okay.
Have
Well,
you got any ghosts? You had 2 people die in the house.
As I said, sometimes, some people pray to St. Anthony to find things, and we just ask Grant Crane where they are, and that's when my keys show up again. And every once in a while, you get a whiff of cherry pipe tobacco in our house. But no, other than that, they're pretty innocuous. We get along okay.
We when we can't find something, we blame the ghost,
Yeah.
Burnus hid the keys again.
I don't know if it's required here in Kansas, but coming from California, you have to disclose if anybody ever died in the house you're selling.
Really?
It depends on the state. It depends on the state, and it depends on how far back the death occurred. Or in some states, you only have to disclose it if it is an unnatural death. I know I've seen some websites that say you should be able to get a third off the price if someone died in your house. But when you think about the statistics of most people hope that if they die, they're surrounded by the people and things that make them happy, right? So it seems really sad to penalize someone on the value of their house because they were able to have that experience. It is a little different if it's mass slaughter of the people inside, and usually those houses now actually get torn down. However, if it's more than 100 years ago, it's considered a interesting selling point. So, if you have a Victorian, they're like, oh, there's this great story attached to this house. You're paying extra for the story of someone dying there. But I think we can respectfully honor and acknowledge the fact that those people were part of the story of the house. And so I don't have a problem disclosing it. I know real estate agents will dance around this as much as they can. And there's actually a great episode of the podcast Criminal where they talk about how, I think it was in New York, where it was a lawsuit that says you have to disclose if the house is haunted, because the concept of being haunted can deter people from buying the house. And the thing is, the woman actually kind of made up the ghost story, but people believed it. And so ultimately it became haunted because everyone said it was. But every state is different. Kansas, I don't know that you have. Jim, do you know Kansas? Do we have to disclose?
I don't remember our realtors ever saying anything about that.
I tried to do a program for realtors about house research, and they all the 2 that showed up said, we don't want to know. We don't want to know anything about your house. because then we have to be ready to tell people. So the less we know, the less liable we are. And that was a really interesting perspective.
Didn't they tear down the house where BTK lived?
Oh.
think
Yes, yes, I believe so. And the house that was associated with the,
Helter Skelter.
yeah, that one, and the guy who, it was the school shooting, Sandy Hook.
Oh,
The bank tore that one down too.
I know in Fresno, where I lived previous to here, that famous, I think it was Marcus Wesson killed his whole family. They came to do a welfare check on the children. He wouldn't let them in. He went and shot all of them in one big bedroom.
Oh,
And that was drawing such a traffic jam. For
Yeah.
months that the city came in and tore it down.
yeah. Now, as a historian, I take a, honor the people there and tell their stories kind of approach. But sometimes I understand why they tore down the house connected to the Sandy Hook murders. They didn't want people going in there I mean, there were magazines with their addresses. You don't want that stuff to end up on eBay. So they just decided to tear that one down. Yeah, but
with mine, they were family members, so
yeah,
if they are ghosts, I'm happy to have them there.
you lived with them before. You can live with them.
One of them I never knew, but yes, my grandpa, I would be happy for him to come by.
Yeah, but I mean, the house that from In Cold Blood, the Clutter family house, it's still there.
Yeah, people still live in it.
People still live in it.
I saw it listed a couple, 2 or 3 years ago.
Yeah, it comes up on the listings, and every time it does, there's a big story about it. There's actually, I'll just mention, there's a really great podcast through Audible. It's 4 episodes. It's called Out Damned Spot, and it's about how to rehabilitate a house that's had something, how to rehabilitate a property that's had something happen. And in one case, somehow a rumor had started that the house had been the site of a mob hit, but it never happened. But people kept breaking into the house looking for mob treasures that didn't exist because it never had anything to do with the mob, or things like, and that's another place where house numbers can change. Nicole Brown Simpson's house is still standing. It's someone's house, but they changed the face of the house and they petitioned to get a new house number to help kind of disguise it and take it out of the public view. So things like that can happen. And so when you're researching, you might run into something like that potentially as well. So, but yeah, every state, different laws. And most real estate agents will try to tell you as little as possible. So, unless it's over 100 years old, and then they can charge you more for it. So, okay, any other questions? I'm going to hang out for a while. We can look through stuff together. Thank you so much. I don't know if someone needs to stop the live stream. Anyone who joined us live stream, thank you. So, okay.
And we had a lady that went through the city directories, and she did this about the businesses. And so you can go by either by street and list everything that was located at that street, or if you go to the back, and you can look up their name, and they'll tell you what pages they're on. So this comes in really handy too.
Oh, what was that drugstore she had?
Nicel's.
Nicel's. I never heard of it. Where was
Yeah,
it?
it was
Where was it at?
nice.
Something like that.
I'm dyslexic.
So do you have multiple copies of these? So what we ended up doing is we took did you need to stop your live stream? Yeah, we should do that real quick. There's an end stream to click on there. That's really easy. So I still have storage. I mean, do you have
You lived in